In his final days, a priest knelt at Padre Pio's bedside and confessed something that had never left those walls until now. He had offered Mass every Sunday for 31 years. He had spoken the words of consecration more than 10,000 times. He had raised the host above the altar before thousands of faces in the pews, and in a voice barely above a whisper, he told Padre Pio that he could not remember the last time he had truly believed any of it. Not with the part of himself that actually mattered. He had gone through the motions for so long that the motions had become him. The words were correct, the gestures were flawless. But somewhere in the last 3 decades, the inside of the act had quietly emptied out, and he had kept going without noticing, because the outside still looked exactly the same. Padre Pio looked at this dying priest for a long moment, and then he said something so precise, so perfectly aimed at the terror behind the confession, that the priest wept for a quarter of an hour without being able to speak. He said, "God was at every one of those masses. He was waiting for you at every single one, and you were not there." Stay with me, because what Padre Pio revealed in that moment, and in dozens of confessional encounters like it, across his decades as a mystic and confessor, is something that reaches far beyond the experience of a single dying priest. It touches every Catholic who has ever stood in a Sunday pew and wondered whether they are truly present or simply present, whether the faith is still alive in them, or whether they have, without ever making the decision to do so, learned to perform it without living it. I want to be honest with you about something before we go any further. This is not a video designed to make you feel guilty for attending Mass. The truth is precisely the opposite of that. What I'm about to share is the most urgent and consistent pastoral teaching Padre Pio gave to souls who loved God, who genuinely wanted to serve God, but who had allowed the familiarity of the sacred to dull the sharpness of their attention to it, who had, slowly and without ever choosing it, mistaken proximity to the sacrament for participation in the sacrament. Let me tell you something most people don't realize about Padre Pio's deepest concern as a confessor. It was not that Catholics were abandoning the Mass. It was that so many of them were attending the Mass without attending the Mass. Their bodies were in the pew. Their mouths were forming the responses correctly. Their hands were folded at the right moments. But the interior life, the place where grace actually lands, where the encounter with the living God actually happens, was somewhere else entirely. Occupied with the mental checklist for the afternoon, rehearsing conversations that had not yet taken place, carrying the residue of last night's argument into the most holy hour of the week without ever noticing the contradiction. Padre Pio called this, in his direct and unflinching way, the secret mockery. Not the mockery of someone who despises God and attends Mass out of social pressure or pure cynicism, but something quieter than that, and in some ways more spiritually dangerous precisely because it is so quiet, the mockery of routine. The slow, invisible corrosion that happens when the most sacred event in the Catholic life becomes merely the most regular event in the Catholic week. When going to Mass is no longer an act of will directed toward God, but simply a thing that Catholics do on Sunday mornings, the way they do laundry on Saturday afternoons. I have seen it with my own eyes in communities I have known for years, and I say this not as a judgment, but as a recognition I found in myself first. Faithful people, good people, people who would have been genuinely hurt to hear someone suggest they were mocking God. Sitting in the pew with the practiced posture of devout attendance, reciting the responses with the fluency of 40 years' practice. And yet, watching their faces through the elevation of the host, you would not have known that something was happening, that God was becoming present on that altar 6 feet in front of them, that heaven and earth were intersecting in a way that should, by any honest accounting, be the most astonishing event of the week. This changed everything for me when I first encountered what Padre Pio taught about this. because he did not frame it as a moral failure. He framed it as a spiritual tragedy, not the tragedy of wickedness, but the tragedy of habit, and a tragedy for which the cure is available, completely available, to any soul willing to actually look at what has been happening. Now let me tell you about what Padre Pio actually saw at Mass, not what he believed about it theologically, which you can find in any catechism, but what he experienced and witnessed with the particular interior perception that God had given him across decades of mystical life. Because his description of what he saw in the pews is unlike anything I have encountered in any other spiritual writing on this subject. Padre Pio celebrated Mass and assisted at Mass with an intensity that unsettled people who did not know him, and that moved deeply the people who did. He regularly spent more than 2 hours at what would normally take 45 minutes, because he was incapable of rushing through the movements. He wept during the consecration with a regularity that was simply a fact of life for those who knew him. Brother friars who watched him elevate the host described seeing his entire body tremble. Fra Modestino, who lived alongside Padre Pio for years and observed him at the altar hundreds of times, said simply, "To watch him at the altar was to understand that something was actually happening there, something that the rest of us were only dimly perceiving, in the way that a person born partially deaf dimly perceives music." Padre Pio himself wrote in letters to his spiritual directors that have been preserved and studied about what he experienced during Mass. He described being transported in some sense beyond ordinary time. He described seeing with the interior perception that God had granted him the full spiritual weight of what occurred on the altar, the representation of Calvary, the actual suffering of Christ made present again for the sake of every soul in that building. The angels gathered in a silence so complete it had its own quality, the souls of the departed drawn near and waiting, and the living faithful in the pews, whose interior states were visible to him in a way he found both luminous and heartbreaking in equal measure. What he described seeing in the pews was not a uniform spiritual experience. He saw two entirely different realities occurring simultaneously in the same physical space. Some souls were what he could only describe as lit, present in a way that made them, to his interior sight, genuinely radiant. Others were absent, physically in the room, going through every correct external motion, but spiritually somewhere else entirely. And the grace of the Mass was flowing toward every soul present without distinction, offering itself with equal generosity to every person in that building, making no judgment about the quality of their attention, but only some of those souls had their interior door open to receive it. Hold on, because what Padre Pio described seeing around the souls who were physically present but spiritually absent is the part of this teaching that I have never heard discussed anywhere outside of his written accounts, and it will change how you think about a distracted Sunday for the rest of your practicing life. He wrote in one letter to Padre Agostino that was preserved in the archives of San Giovanni Rotondo that during a Mass he celebrated in the early years of his priesthood, he was given a vision of particular clarity about the spiritual condition of the souls before him. He wrote, "I saw the faithful as they truly were before God. Some were radiant with attention and love, others were present only in their bodies, and around those absent souls I saw what their absence had made room for, not through any catastrophic sin, but through the simple, terrible vacuum of a will that has stopped directing itself toward God during the 1 hour it was most meant to." He was careful not to be sensational about what filled that vacuum. He described it in different ways at different times to different spiritual confidants. But the consistent thread across all those descriptions was this: the interior that is not focused on God during the Mass is not empty, it is occupied by the ordinary contents of an unguarded mind. The anxieties and resentments and preoccupations and half-formed plans that normally live below the surface of the day rising up to fill the space that was meant for that 1 hour to be given entirely to God. Few Catholics know this, but Padre Pio was genuinely troubled throughout his priestly life by what he perceived as a widespread misunderstanding of what active participation in the Mass actually requires. He was not speaking about liturgical forms or the language of the rite. He was speaking about the interior posture with which a soul approaches the altar of God, and he was specific about what that interior posture requires. It does not require perfect theological comprehension of every prayer. It does not require the emotional intensity of a religious crisis. It requires, at minimum, the orientation of the will toward God, the conscious decision, however imperfect and however briefly sustained, to be here and not somewhere else, to actually show up to the encounter that is being offered. He said to a woman named Giuseppina, who had attended Mass faithfully for 40 years and had come to him bewildered by the complete spiritual dryness she felt during every Sunday liturgy, "You have been going to the place, but you have stopped going to the encounter, and these are not the same thing. The place remains. The encounter requires a decision." But now here is the part of Padre Pio's teaching that goes deeper than the diagnosis of absence, because he did not stop at identifying what was missing. He identified what was accumulating in its place across years of habitual external practice without interior engagement. And what he described is what I want you to hear most clearly today. Padre Pio told Giuseppina, "Every Mass you have attended has offered you something, and every time you were not truly present to receive it, that offering was made and returned unopened. God does not withdraw it in anger. He holds it for you. He waits with a patience that has no bottom. But the soul that habitually receives the offering of the Mass without opening to it becomes, gradually, less capable of opening, not because God refuses to give, but because the habit of closure trains the interior. You have spent 40 years teaching yourself not to be moved by what should move you most, and now you are surprised that you cannot feel it. This is the spiritual boomerang at the center of habitual false piety, the thing that Padre Pio identified as one of the most spiritually ironic dangers in the practicing Catholic life. The very practice that is meant to sustain and nourish the soul can, when engaged without interior engagement, actually deepen the spiritual dryness it was designed to cure. Not because the sacrament fails, not because God withdraws, but because a soul that attends the Mass externally, year after year, decade after decade, is being formed by that pattern. It is being confirmed in its habitualness. It is being trained in going through the motions, and the motions, over time, separated from their interior content, produce a kind of spiritual callousness. The soul of a person who can stand before the consecrated host on the altar and feel genuinely nothing, not because they are wicked, because they have spent years habituating themselves out of the capacity to be astonished by what they are seeing. Padre Pio wept over this. His spiritual children recorded numerous instances of him weeping at the confessional in a way that startled the penitent. Not because the sin confessed was monstrous, but because he could see the interior state of the soul in front of him with a clarity that required no description from them. And the souls that made him weep most were not the dramatic sinners. They were the faithful Catholics who had done everything externally correct for decades, who attended every Sunday without fail, who kept every precept, who wore the brown scapular and prayed the rosary, and who could not understand why their interior life felt like a riverbed that had not seen rain in years, who had never connected that dryness to what was happening, or rather, what was not happening inside them every Sunday morning. Wait, because I need to tell you about 3 specific people who came to Padre Pio with this exact complaint. 3 people at 3 different stages of life, with 3 different versions of the same spiritual problem. And what he said to each of them is both the most honest and the most merciful thing I have encountered in all my years studying his pastoral approach to the interior life. The first was a devout Catholic woman, a mother of 6 children, who had attended daily Mass for 22 years without missing a single day unless she was too ill to leave the house. She came to Padre Pio in genuine distress because she had begun to feel that the Mass meant absolutely nothing to her anymore. She could sit through the entire liturgy from the entrance procession to the final blessing without a single moment of what she would have called genuine spiritual contact. She feared she was losing her faith. She was frightened at the depth of her own interior emptiness. Padre Pio listened to her fully and then said, "You are not losing your faith. You are losing your sentimentality. These are not the same thing, and it is important that you understand the difference. Your faith is intact, but you have confused the feeling of faith with faith itself. For 22 years you have been fed at the table of God. You have eaten faithfully and well. And now the nourishment is so much a part of you that you no longer feel it entering. A person who eats bread every day does not feel the gratitude of a person who has been starving. This is not ingratitude, it is saturation. And the answer is not to stop eating. The answer is to learn to eat with attention again." He gave her a specific practice. For 30 days, she was to arrive at Mass 10 minutes early, not to say extra prayers, not to prepare a longer act of contrition, but to spend those 10 minutes in a single specific act, a prayer composed entirely in her own words, never the same twice, addressed to the specific words of that day's gospel. Her personal, immediate response to the word she was about to hear proclaimed, not a formula, a conversation. Her actual thoughts, her actual response, her actual self offered as the starting point, and she was to bring that personal offering into the Mass with her and place it consciously, deliberately, on the altar at the offertory as her particular gift to God on that particular morning. After 30 days, she returned to him. She said, "I don't know exactly what has changed, but I arrive at Mass now with something to give, something that is mine, and the hour feels different." The second person was an elderly man, a retired schoolteacher, who had attended Sunday Mass for 61 consecutive years without a single missed Sunday, except during 2 hospitalizations. He came to Padre Pio not because of spiritual dryness, but because of a terminal diagnosis that had forced him for the first time in his life to think seriously about what came after death. And in thinking seriously about what came after death, he had arrived at a realization that shocked him to his core. Despite 61 years of Sunday Mass attendance, he did not know God. He knew about God with considerable precision. He could discuss the sacraments intelligently. He could explain the theology of the Mass in accurate terms. But he did not know God the way you know a person you have actually met. He had spent 61 years in the presence of God at the Mass without ever introducing himself. Padre Pio said to him, "You have attended a meeting for 61 years at which the host knew your name and you never learned his. This is not unusual. It is the quiet tragedy of many faithful lives. But you have time, not unlimited time. But you have today, and today is the only day in which the introduction can be made." He told the old man he did not need to change anything about his Sunday practice. He only needed to add one thing. Before each Mass, for whatever brief time he had available, he was to close his eyes and speak God's name, not in any formula, not with any theological framework around it. Simply to speak the name with the awareness, held as concretely as possible, that someone was listening. That someone had been listening for 61 years and had never, not once, stopped waiting to be addressed as a person rather than acknowledged as a principle. The old man lived 11 more months. Those who knew him in those 11 months said he had become almost unrecognizable in his interior peace. A man who had spent 6 decades going through the motions died in a state of what his children described as quiet, steady joy that none of them could fully account for or explain. The third person was a young priest, newly ordained, who came to Padre Pio not in crisis, but with a preventive question. How does a priest keep the Mass from becoming routine when he celebrates it every single day? He was 28 years old and already feeling in the first months of his priesthood the early warning signs of what he had observed in older priests. That particular quality of focused indifference with which some of them moved through the liturgy, like skilled craftsmen producing a reliable product. He did not want that. He had entered the priesthood on fire. He was afraid of the man he might become in 30 years if nothing protected him from the slow erosion of daily repetition. Padre Pio looked at this young priest for a long moment before answering, and then he said, "You will become numb to the Mass the moment you stop being astonished by what it is. Not what it means theologically, what it is. The remedy for spiritual routine is not more effort or more discipline or a better prayer preparation. It is more astonishment. Before every Mass for the rest of your priesthood, ask yourself one question. Ask it as if you are asking it for the first time every time, without the protection of familiarity. The question is simply, what am I about to do? Not what am I about to perform? What am I about to do? Let the full weight of the true answer reach you before you put on the vestments. Let it find you every time you ask it, even when you are tired beyond words, even when you have done it 10,000 times, even when the congregation is 3 elderly women and the church is cold and nothing in the environment communicates the gravity of what is about to occur. You know what is about to occur. Let that knowing be enough." That young priest later wrote in his memoirs that those words from Padre Pio were the foundation of his entire priestly interior life for the next 53 years. He celebrated Mass until he was 79 years old, and those who assisted at his Masses in his final years said that he never looked like a man who had done this too many times. He looked like a man who had just understood for the first time what he was doing. This is the paradox Padre Pio revealed to everyone who came to him with this particular spiritual complaint, the reversal at the center of all his teaching on habitual piety. The problem is not that the Mass has become routine. The problem is that you have become routine. God has not changed. What happens on that altar every Sunday is identical to what happened on the first Sunday in the upper room and on the first Good Friday at Golgotha. The same sacrifice, the same presence, the same offer of grace, so complete and so inexhaustible that it could sustain the entire history of the Church until the end of time without diminishing by a single measure. What has changed is the quality of your arrival, the sharpness of your attention, the openness of the interior door. And this means, Padre Pio insisted with great consistency, that the remedy is never outside you. No change of parish, no better music, no more aesthetically satisfying liturgical environment, no different Mass time will fix what is broken if what is broken is your interior engagement with the living God who is present. The hunger must be rekindled from the inside, and only one thing rekindles it: returning to the truth of what is actually happening on the altar and allowing that truth to become real again. Not as an article of faith repeated from memory, as an event happening in front of you right now, today, to which you are either genuinely present or genuinely absent. Now I need to return to the dying priest from the beginning of this video, because what happened in that room after he confessed to Padre Pio that he had been absent from his own Masses for 31 years, is the resolution that everything I have shared today has been building toward. After Padre Pio said to him, "God was at every one of those Masses waiting for you, and you were not there," the priest sat in a silence that went on for a long time. He was not weeping anymore. He was very still. And then he asked the question that had been forming behind his silence. He said, "Is it too late?" Padre Pio did not answer immediately. He looked at the priest with an expression that those who witness such moments in his confessional described as containing equal parts sorrow and absolute certainty. And then he said the three words that completed the sentence that had seemed so devastating. "But you are here now." 3 words. You are here now. The priest understood that Padre Pio was not speaking only about the deathbed. He was speaking about the only moment that has ever mattered for any soul approaching God. Not the accumulated past of what they did or failed to do, but the quality of presence they are bringing to this moment, right now, today. The entire question of whether a person is truly at the Mass, truly at prayer, truly in the presence of God, reduces to this. Are you here now? Not in a state of perfect attention, not in a condition of spiritual peak experience, but here with the door open, however slightly, however imperfectly, however humbly, receiving what is being offered. The priest spent his remaining weeks attending Mass from his hospital chapel when his body would allow it, and attending it in his imagination with extraordinary deliberateness on the days it would not. He said to the friar who attended him in his final hours that he had never been so present at the Mass as he was in those last weeks when everything that had previously occupied his interior, the worries, the projects, the professional self-consciousness of a man who celebrated the liturgy in front of others, had fallen away and left him with nothing but the bare fact of what was happening on the altar and his own bare willingness to receive it. He died in great peace. Those present described it as remarkable, given the fear with which he had entered that confession. The friar who attended him said, "He died the way Padre Pio described people dying who have finally found what they were always looking for, not in a rush of religious feeling, in a very quiet and complete interior rest." This is the whole of what Padre Pio taught about the Sunday habit. Not that you should feel terrible for the years of going through the motions. Not that the accumulated weight of your external practice without interior engagement has permanently damaged your relationship with God, but that you do not have to arrive at the end of your life at 30 years of offered masses or 60 years of Sunday pews and realize that you were almost always somewhere else. You can decide to be here now. This Sunday, this consecration, this moment of receiving, you can open the door that has been standing closed, not against God's desire but against your own habit, and find that the grace that has been waiting for you has not diminished by a single measure in all the years it was waiting. You have just received the heart of Padre Pio's most consistent pastoral teaching on the interior life of the practicing Catholic. Not a new external practice to add to the list, not another devotion to perform correctly, but an invitation, direct and personal, to understand what is actually happening on that altar every Sunday, and to decide, consciously and deliberately, to be present for it. The sacrament has always been capable of transforming you. The only question Padre Pio ever pressed his penitents to answer for themselves was whether they were capable of showing up to receive the transformation. Padre Pio said that those who bring divine truth to suffering souls participate in the work of salvation itself. This channel exists for the Catholics who are doing everything right externally and wondering why it is not reaching them, who are faithful and dry and exhausted and confused, who need someone to say plainly, "You are not broken, you are absent, and absent is a condition that can be changed." If this teaching found you today, the super thanks button beneath this video is your way of saying that this work should continue, that these souls matter, and that the truths Padre Pio gave from that confessional deserve to keep traveling until they reach every person who needs them. You are not just a viewer of this channel, you are part of why it exists. Now let me give you something concrete to carry into your next Sunday Mass, not a new practice to perform. 3 questions. The questions that Padre Pio, in one form or another, placed before every soul who came to him with the particular spiritual emptiness we have been discussing today. They are not comfortable questions, they are merciful ones, because a question that shows you honestly where you are is always the beginning of the road to where you want to be. The first question is this: what am I bringing to this Mass that is actually mine? Not your general presence, not your loyal attendance record, something particular and personal. A gratitude so specific you could name the moment it arrived. A petition so real it has been with you all week. A confusion so genuine you have not been able to resolve it on your own. A grief that has not lifted. Padre Pio observed that souls who arrive at the Mass with something genuinely personal to offer tend to leave with something genuinely personal received. The interior posture of a person who arrives with something in their hands is fundamentally different from the interior posture of a person who arrives to fulfill an obligation. And God, who sees the interior posture, responds to it with corresponding specificity. Before your next Mass, sit for 5 minutes with this question alone. What is actually mine today? What am I truly bringing? Whatever the answer is, bring it. Do not clean it up first. The second question: am I allowing the consecration to be an event, or am I allowing it to be a procedure? Padre Pio's entire spirituality of the Mass was built on one foundational conviction. What happens at the consecration is not a liturgical symbol of something that occurred once, long ago, at a geographical distance from where you are sitting. It is something happening now, in this building, at this altar, 6 feet from where your body is. The body and blood of Christ becoming present. The sacrifice of Calvary made present again. That reality is either astonishing or it is familiar. And it becomes merely familiar only to those who have stopped actually thinking about what they believe when they say they believe it. Before your next consecration, for just the duration of the elevation, let the full weight of the claim land on you without the insulation of habit, not as a doctrine, as an event. Let yourself be in the presence of something that is actually happening. The third question is the one Padre Pio gave to people who found themselves arriving at Mass with nothing of their own to offer, when the spiritual dryness was so complete that even trying to generate personal intention felt like pushing against a locked door. He said, "Come for someone else. Offer this Mass and the grace you will receive from it, for a soul who cannot come, for a soul in purgatory who has no one praying for them, for a child who has left the faith, for a marriage you know is dying, for a neighbor whose suffering is visible and whose faith is absent." Arriving at the Mass for someone else, Padre Pio taught, can crack open the interior door for yourself in a way that arriving for yourself sometimes cannot. Because love directed outward reopens channels that self-focused effort sometimes cannot reach. And it is impossible to offer the Mass for another soul with genuine intention without being, at least for that moment, genuinely present yourself. These 3 questions are not a program. They are not a spiritual method to be followed correctly. They are simply 3 doors into the one interior space where the Mass has always been trying to reach you, where grace has been waiting for you every Sunday of your practicing life, with a patience that has no limit and a generosity that has no bottom. Padre Pio was absolutely clear about this, and I want to end with it because it is the thing I most want you to carry away from everything you have heard today. The grace of the Mass does not diminish with your absence from it. It accumulates, it waits, and the soul that returns to genuine interior presence at the Mass after years of external practice alone does not arrive to a place of lack. It arrives to a place of abundance that has been set aside and held in trust with perfect faithfulness by a God who has never once considered stopping. And you, sitting wherever you are right now, having heard all of this, what kind of Sunday Mass are you attending? Not the one you intend to attend, not the one you attended in your most devotional season, the one you are actually attending now. What is the quality of your presence? And what would it cost you this Sunday to show up differently? Write your answer in the comments below. You do not have to be eloquent. You do not have to be ashamed. You only have to be honest. And your honesty, offered here, may be the thing that gives someone else, sitting in spiritual dryness, somewhere in the world tonight, the courage to finally ask themselves the question they have been avoiding.